Okay, this is the third time I've tried to do this lecture recorded. It's just, oh, not working. So 2 fails. This is going to be it, right? Third time's a charm. So more about data collection, data designs. So to reorient you, what we did was we looked at chapter 4. Chapter 4 talked about some basic design. And then chapters 10, 11, and 12 go a little bit more in depth into those designs. And so chapter 4, you learned a little bit about survey research. Chapter 10, you're going to learn a little bit more about survey research. I just want to put those things together for you instead of waiting and then coming back and adding more information. We'll see how useful this is. I think it'll be more useful than trying to fit it in at the end. So we're going to talk more about survey. And so in order to do that, let's quickly review the idea of 3 basic designs: frequency, association, and causal designs. If you remember, a frequency design will give us information about a variable. And so, like, what does it do in the population? What's the highest level it's at? What's the average level? How much variability? These kinds of designs can look like an observation, a case study, or a survey. And a survey basically is where you just gather information about something and you don't connect it to anything else. And so that information might be anxiety. So you're just getting information about anxiety, but it's not connected to anything. It's not even connected to gender or age or some of those basic variables, because then what you're doing is you can look at an association between gender, age, geography, etc. That's an association, 2 variables. And so 1 variable only, that is frequency. When we look, oops, I put this in the wrong order, possibly not. Maybe I just don't have one for this. Oh, you know what? This is the one for that. Okay, I'm not going to start this over because third time, right? Third time, not starting over. Okay, so the next idea is association. We have how 2 variables are related. So here you might have anxiety and gender, or anxiety and age, or anxiety and geographical area, or breakfast cereal, or music major, whatever. So 2 variables are related. They co-vary. That's what that means. They vary together. So that might mean that one goes up when one goes down. That's still co-varying. You don't have to go the same direction when you're co-varying. It's just that when one changes, the other changes too. That's what it means to co-vary. For example, if I look at anxiety and it doesn't change depending on anything else, let's say I look at anxiety versus gender, anxiety versus geography, anxiety versus levels of vitamin D, anxiety versus breakfast cereals you eat, anxiety versus sleep. And it never seems to connect with anything. There's no correlation at all. Then it's not co-varying with other variables that I've measured. You can predict with an association. So if there are 17 million blue cars out there and they're owned 70% by women, then you might say, if I see a blue car, I can predict it's probably owned by a woman. That is how you use an association to predict. And so you have these relationships of a positive prediction, negative prediction, 0 relationship. So a positive prediction would mean they co-vary in the same direction, right? And so the higher the anxiety, the higher the sleep problems might be one thing. If you've got 2 continuous variables, more sleep problems leads to more anxiety. It's associated with anxiety. And so that would be a positive relationship. In the same way, less anxiety leads to less sleep difficulty. Those both go down. They're negative together. They're like negative in terms of less than, but it's not what we call a negative relationship. It's still a positive relationship because they're both going in the same direction. So even if they're both going down, and we think of down as negative, it doesn't mean it's a negative relationship. It's still a positive relationship because in this case, positive means the direction that you're traveling. If you're traveling together in the same direction, it's a positive relationship. whether that direction is up or down. If you're traveling in different directions, that's what a negative relationship is. And so if your anxiety goes up and your sleep quality also, let's see, I'm going to make this confusing. If your anxiety is high and your depression is low, then we would call that a negative relationship, because the higher your anxiety goes, the lower your depression is. They're moving in opposite directions, but they're still moving together. So the idea is that if they move together, they're correlated, and they could be in a positive or a negative relationship. They move together either in the same direction or in opposite directions, but they're moving together. So they're co-varying. If there's no relationship, one goes up, one goes nothing, then that's a zero relationship. So when we look at correlation studies, we are looking at how can we connect these two variables? Do they have a connection? So you can predict one from the other. You can use observations, you can use surveys, you can use archival data. Any of these things can give you variables that you can then create an association between. So for an example, I looked for my master's thesis, I looked at a scale that was out there that predicted whether somebody was lying or they call that faking bad or faking good. So I guess either way would be lying. Either trying to look worse or trying to look better than they actually are on a particular personality test. And so I correlated their score from the scale to their score on a different test that had a known predictor. So the MMPI has something called a K scale. The K scale on the MMPI measures defensiveness, or it measures people trying to say that they're just doing better than they actually are. People being a little defensive. In other words, they're presenting themselves as more healthy psychologically than they realistically are. And so this scale in MMPI can measure defensiveness. We call it the K scale. It's been around for years and years and years, decades. And lots of research has been done on the K scale. So it's kind of like a gold standard for faking good, for being defensive. And so I correlated, or I looked at the covariance, the relationship between this K scale and the other scale that I was examining. And so I looked at how they related together. If one went up, did the other go up? If one went down, did the other go down? And yes, indeed, they did. So I found a positive relationship. There was a correlation between not my scale, but the scale I was examining and this MMPI K scale, right? So I could predict them. They don't cause each other. They're just associated so that if I saw one scale, I could predict the other scale with a pretty good likelihood of being accurate. And then there's causality, right? So with causality, one variable actually changes the other variable. And so researchers figure this out by manipulating one variable. They manipulate the independent variable, they measure the dependent variable. Just a quick review, because I know we've covered this already. When other variables are held constant, then you know the manipulated variable is the one that affected the dependent variable or the outcome variable. So let's apply this now to survey research. And this is going to be like the meat of today. And hopefully this will give you more of a thorough idea about what we were talking about in chapter 4 with surveys. It's not a lot of extra information. So the goal here when you do survey research is you want to get a true idea about the population. You want to ask them about things that you really can't easily observe. So if you could observe people's feelings reliably just by watching them, and get really great, accurate, true information, maybe you would do that. But since we really generally can't, to some extent you can, but there are lots of things we want to know about people that we can't tell by looking at them. So anxiety is another great example. Somebody might be sitting in a chair and you might say, well, they really look anxious, but they might just be a person who looks anxious. Or it might be a person who's very anxious who doesn't look anxious. And so we want to give them a questionnaire or a survey in order to figure out if they really are anxious. So again, when we're using the word survey, you could substitute questionnaire and you would be fine. So you want to get a true idea about the population by asking like a representative sample of that population about a thing that you can't figure out through observation. There are problems with survey research. And so there's plenty of questionnaires and research that is designed poorly. So if you have a poorly designed questionnaire, then here are some of the things that can happen. The person might interpret your questions differently than you intended. And so if your questions are not precisely worded or not tested out, maybe your questions aren't useful, they might get interpreted in a way that you had no idea that's what a person would think. This is why when you want to create a questionnaire, you have to do a lot of pilot study where you practice giving that questionnaire, seeing what kind of responses you get, and then modifying the questionnaire to be more and more accurate. And so some problems is people who take it might interpret your question in a weird way. Maybe the questions that are on there are not actually useful in terms of identifying the truth. Like let's say you're looking at how anxious are you, and then you ask a question, do you like bears? Maybe liking bears is not highly related to being anxious, or maybe it's not the best kind of question that you could put in. So that's not a useful question. Maybe your questions push them toward an answer that they may not have said yes to otherwise. Maybe your questions are, anxiety is really a problem and only problematic people have anxiety. Do you have anxiety? Well, then it's pretty likely you're going to be like, nope to that, because the way that they ask the question. So your questions can't be asked in ways that create an answer that wouldn't have been there otherwise. You can't answer questions, or you can't ask questions that are not representative of the whole. Another issue is you answer questions, the way the people answer the questions might make their results unrepresentative. So for example, let's say you give a questionnaire and people tend to only pick the middle answers. They don't pick extreme answers at all. So they're going to answer, like, let's say it's a scale of 0 to 10. All of their answers are like 5, 6, 7. Maybe there's a 4, maybe there's an 8, but most of them are 5 or 6 and 7. And so then you get this idea that they're more in the middle than they may actually be because of their style of answering questions. Vice versa, you can also get people who answer to the extreme, and all their answers are like 1 or 2 or 0 or 9 or 10, and there's nothing in the middle. That's another way of response. We call it a response set. A response set. It's a way of answering that might make their answers unrepresentative of the whole. Or they might just tend to answer 2 all the time instead of 1. And so it doesn't matter what the question is, they're just kind of geared toward answering positively. So you want to make sure that you're adding in questions that are geared to capture everyone's response set. So you might do something like have some questions be positive and some questions be negative. You might have some questions ask things in 2 different ways. Like you're asking about the same thing in 2 different ways, or maybe 4 different ways. So you want to make sure that you're really getting a true sense of what that population's experience is through your survey. Ways to maximize your survey construction. You can use the best scales. So we're going to talk a little bit more about scales in chapter 5. You can have an open-ended scale like, what kinds of trees do you like? Or what kind of breakfast cereal do you like? You can have a close-ended scale. You could say something like, what kind of breakfast cereal do you prefer? Sugary, lots of fiber, lots of raisins, colorful. So those are 4 different options. Those options aren't really related to each other than in breakfast cereal. So those are really nominal scale options, just names of categories. Or you could say, do you like sugary sugary cereal on a scale of 0 to 10, how much do you like sugary cereal? And that's going to be more of a continuous type of scale where you're looking at from 0 to 10 continuously, how much do you want sugar in your cereal? So you want to word these questions accurately and use good quality scales for your questions so that you can get reliable and valid results. So when you're wording questions, you want to avoid double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions you can read about in your book, but double-barreled questions are essentially saying you're asking two different things at the same time. And so it's like, well, which one are you going to answer? Or maybe one of them the person disagrees with, but the other one they don't disagree with. There's no good way to answer that question in a way that is representative of how you really feel. So you want to avoid those, avoid leading questions. You want to be clear and precise in your language so you're not confusing your respondent. And surveys, the longer a survey is, usually the more thorough and valid it is, except to the point to where people quit answering questions or they just get tired and start answering whatever because the survey is too long. So you have to balance how long the survey is with how much, how comprehensive the answers are. Surveys can describe, I can talk. Surveys can describe and predict. So you can describe when you do a frequency study, like we talked about with the blue cars, et cetera, breakfast food variety. Here are some examples. You can pause and read. You can predict when you get covariating information, when you get information that is associated with another variable, you know, not just straight up information that's not associated with another variable, then you can predict. So surveys can do both of those things. Surveys that predict need more than one variable. Okay, the last thing really to talk about is response validity. When people respond to your survey, they're going to give you a bunch of information that will help you decide how good a job is your survey doing. How well constructed a questionnaire do you have? And so what you want to look at is the reliability of the responses and the validity. So the validity of the responses is measured by criterion validity often. We talked about that already: criterion validity, face validity, content validity, construct validity. Does it correlate with another gold standard? That's one great way to measure the validity of your questionnaire. You also need to have a reliable questionnaire. If it's not reliable, it's hard for it to be valid. And so being reliable is critical for validity. You can give the survey to the same person more than once. That's one way to measure reliability, assuming that the person is not changing and that the survey is not measuring something that's subject to change. And so let's say you're talking about IQ. So you give somebody the same IQ test every month, and you say you give it 3 times. Then you've got 3 different measurements. They should all be pretty much the same. So you've got test, retest, reliability. You could also see if the person's scores on part of the survey are consistent with their scores on another part of the survey. So let's say you give them an IQ test again, and they do a pretty good job in one area of IQ, and then you would predict they should do a pretty good job in another area of IQ. So we call this split half reliability or internal consistency. How consistent are the questions? Interestingly, with IQ, they actually have subtests that may show different things in terms of people's overall performance. And so they match the scores within the subtest so that they're internally consistent. So all the scores in a subtest should give you the same basic picture. But different subtests give you a little bit of a different feel for the person. And so you can have different subtests that don't correlate very highly. You know, let's say somebody's verbal IQ is high and then their spatial task, you know, the IQ that measures spatial relationships. Let's say that that's a little different. Well, then that's useful information clinically, But what you're really looking at are two different tests that are all put together in the same IQ test. And so if you're going to look at split half reliability or internal consistency, what you want to do is look at what's within the subtests. So sometimes you'll have a survey or a questionnaire that has different parts that measure different things. And then in that case, it's not appropriate to put all of the things into the same split half reliability or internal consistency test to see if they all connect. You want to make sure that the test or the questions that connect are the ones that are supposed to connect. And so they're in that part of the survey where they all go together. Hope that makes sense. So when you're looking at, do questions correlate with each other? You could look at split half reliability. You could look at internal consistency. How did the questions correlate with other questions? And then you can also look in a kind of a global way at the whole questionnaire. How do all of the items correlate with all the other items? If they all seem to correlate well with each other, then that's another measure of reliability called internal consistency. We call that Cronbach's alpha. So to summarize this slide again, you can find ways to measure the reliability of your questionnaire. Reliability can be measured using test-retest reliability. You can use split half or internal consistency reliability. This is where you're looking at the consistency of the questions. Are they all measuring about the same thing? And then you can correlate every single item with all the other items and then take the average of that correlation. That is Cronbach's alpha. You can also look at validity of your survey by comparing it with a criterion. Okay, so sum up, survey research. Survey research can describe or predict. You can use frequency or observation with your questionnaires when you're doing survey research. Survey research is usually just one thing in time. In other words, you're not taking the survey over and over and over. You're just asked something once and there's no manipulated variable that's occurring. If you use a questionnaire as part of an experiment, then you'll probably have them take it more than one time, a pre and a post, or some sort of method where the survey responses depend on a manipulated variable. And in that case, you're still using questionnaires. So it could still be, you could call it, we're giving them a survey, but it's not the same thing as doing survey research. You want to prevent problems in your research by using well-constructed surveys. You want reliable, valid surveys. And you can measure that reliability and validity. And you can compare results of your survey to a known standard to support whether your results or your questionnaire is a valid questionnaire. How does this apply to your study? This is the question now. So, are you planning to use a questionnaire in your study? Most of you probably are planning on using some sort of questionnaire as your measurement in a study. And so if you think about the questionnaire that you want to put into your study, how do you apply today's learning to that questionnaire? Well, you'd want something reliable and valid, that's for sure. And you want to make sure when you do your procedure, in terms of how you administer the questionnaire, you probably don't want to hand it to them while they're at the grocery store. You probably don't want to make them fill it out while they're going for a job. You want to think about a way that you can give it to them so that they are filling it out in an ideal, relaxed way, so they're not pressured, so they're not feeling like they have to answer in any one particular way. And so better application of this information will lead you to better internal validity for your study. So start giving it some thought, because you'll have to write out your procedure section that describes how did you do the study. And it goes step by step by step by step. How did you do it? And so think about, what do I know now about administering questionnaires that will help me design my study? And next we'll talk about chapter 11 tomorrow. That's all for today.